All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We'll wait for about a minute or two for some others to join us, and then we'll get going.
I don't think I've ever used this app before. It's even got a nice neon sign at the top that says on air. Quite impressive.
We get fancy at SASA. All right, we'll just get one more minute just in case anyone wants to pop on and do this live with us. Now, where are you, Alex? What area of the world?
I'm in Yorkshire in England.
Okay, lovely. Perfect.
What about yourself?
I am in Arizona, so the beautiful Southwest.
Oh, wow. What's the temperature over there?
Today it's 90 degrees, so it's warm. We
Warmer
don't
than.
love it. We love cooler weather over here.
Yeah.
All right, I think we can go ahead and get going if you're ready. Welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us for the second masterclass in our birthday bash lineup. We're here with Alex Harvey, and he's going to be speaking with us about who were the first Vikings. So thank you, Alex, for being here. We really appreciate it.
Hello, thank you for having me. I'll just go ahead and share my screen and then we're in. There we go. All right, just double check you can see that. All right.
Let me.
All good.
Yes, you are good.
Brilliant. All right, then we'll get straight into it. So, the big question: who were the first Vikings? The Viking Age occupies a most perennial spot on not just the British history timeline, but also European history more generally. It's beyond the ancient world. It's slightly at the dawn of the wider medieval period, and often it's imagined as starting slap bang 793 or 793 AD, depending on one's persuasion. And on the other end of the spectrum, it ends in 1066. Now, there's a reason for these dates. The first is the infamous Lindisfarne raid in June of 793, which is often regarded as the first Viking raid of its kind, or at least the first recorded raid. On the other end, 1066 September, just outside York, King Harold Hardrada was gutted and given 6 feet of English soil by Harold Godwinson. Thus ended the Viking Age. Now, of course, if you were living through either one of those events, you didn't know that you'd entered a new historical period, nor did you know that you were in one and that it had just ended. So it's very difficult for us as historians, archaeologists, and linguists to peel back through the fog of history and take a look and just assume that we enter these new periods, because of course people at the time would not recognize it as such. So the emphasis of this masterclass is to try to move away from seeing the Lindisfarne raid as this big start point of the Viking Age and to approach it from a slower, earlier perspective that values a mixture of disciplines and tries to unpick and answer the question: if Lindisfarne wasn't the first Viking raid, what evidence do we have that can lead us to a safer guess? Now, this is all drawn from various research projects that I've done both in the academic and commercial publishing worlds. You'll see on the kind of right-hand side of the screen there 2 upcoming books. Now, the one in blue I am co-authoring with Hilbert Vinkenog, and it's all about the research that I'll be talking about today. So this is my background. I absolutely love the early medieval period, especially the Viking Age. Now, before we get in, this isn't really housekeeping, but it's just something I like from the 8th century. This is a translated piece of Latin dialogue from the tutor Alcuin of York, speaking to one of his students on the continent. And for me, I just think it crosses the timelines really nicely. Now, as then we go to these conferences, we go to masterclasses, we go to lessons and lectures and so on to learn new things. Read joyfully, or in your case, listen joyfully. And what we're going to be talking about today is 4 main topics that all kind of lead into that one question: who were the first Vikings? We're first going to have a look at the stereotypical silhouette of the Viking image. What does it mean? What does the word mean? And also think about the ships that they sailed. The Viking longship, I'm sure most people can picture it in their head. It's got a very unique silhouette. But does the invention, or rather the development of that technology, show us anything about the first raiders? Can we pinpoint when the Viking longship appears? Is it before or is it during the so-called Viking Age? Then we're going to have a look at the crew of those ships, the pirates. It's a pirate life for me, it's a pirate's life for you. We're going to look at the motivations, why people went Viking in the first place. Spoiler alert, it's not really because of a hatred of Christianity, nor because of a lack of farmland in Scandinavia. It's something perhaps much simpler. Then we're going to have a look at the names that these groups were given, or rather the names that various pirate groups were given operating in and around the North Sea before and leading up to the Viking Age. Because being a pirate, being a Viking, is not necessarily a uniquely Scandinavian phenomenon, nor is it confined to the years 793 to 1066. Once we kind of remove ourselves from these terms, we can rely and use earlier Roman ethnographic terms and just have a look at what, for example, Roman administrators thought of the people who were predating upon their waters. And are they the same people as the later Vikings? Then finally, we're going to look at 5 examples of possible evidence for pre-Lindisfarne activity within the British Isles. So, Vikings, very popular. There's a reason I like them. There's a reason you're here today listening to me yap about them. If you type in Viking, Vikings, Viking raid, Viking attack, you'll get a familiar set of images. Some of them might be a bit different nowadays because of the advent of AI slop, but this Google search was from a few weeks ago. And it's about what you'd expect. Pillars of smoke, flames licking the edges of buildings, angry men screaming either in a reenactment or an artistic depiction. And some of these illustrations are actually near contemporary. Others are later additions. Now, the word Viking, it wasn't an ethnic term. It doesn't exclusively belong to raiders from Denmark, Norway, or Sweden. Rather, its original usage, indeed its earliest usage that we know of, seems to just refer to the act of raiding altogether, which has no set geographic origin. So the earliest cognate for Viking, which is the Old English word Viking, appears in 2 continental glossaries from the 8th century. And there it just means sea rover or sea raider, or essentially a pirate. Now, you wouldn't look at Captain Jack Sparrow, for example, and view him as a Viking, nor would you view pirate as an ethnic term. To some degree, we have authors like Sir Walter Scott, the godfather of historical fiction, to thank for popularizing perhaps what one might call the misuse of the term Viking. In any case, this popular image and aesthetic is one that can be rightly challenged, sometimes in exciting ways. I don't think that divorcing this period from the stereotypical image of the Vikings makes them any less interesting. And if you can still see my face, because I can't currently when I'm talking, I might occasionally do quotation marks when I say the word Viking. I tend to use the term Scandinavian pirate, but like I said, not all raiders were from Scandinavia. We're going to talk about a few of the other groups as well. So let's begin. Evolution. Evolution of what? Well, we're talking about Viking longships, or to divorce them from that term, just longships generally. Now, the Oseberg ship is the most famous example. It was excavated in the early 20th century. It's currently under renovation and will be debuting again in Oslo in the near future. But its earliest ancestor, if you like, dates quite a while earlier than the Viking Age. If we go back, for example, the Oseberg ship is pretty decent, 830. That's in the Viking Age for about 40 years or so. The Hjortspring boat, on the other hand, it's a smaller, Danish and much muddier kind of distant cousin, is, nearly 1,000 years younger than the Viking Age itself. So why am I even talking about it? Well, it's clinker built, for one, which means that the planks are overlapping. So instead of being carvel built like a standard barrel, or certainly a lot of Frankish vessels from later on, clinker building allows boats to glide atop waves, almost like a knife. Now, this shipbuilding tradition is not unique to Scandinavia. Indeed, I think the earliest vessel is actually from Israel, a few years earlier than the Hjortspring example. However, it was popularized within early medieval Scandinavia, and it was a tradition that spread up along the North Way, the fjords of Norway, into the Danish Isles, and so on. So the Viking longship that we'll get to very soon, it borrows from similar design principles. So often in history books about the Vikings, and I'm guilty of this myself, we start with the Hjortspring boat. It was discovered in what was once a bog alongside the remains of lots of warriors. So even though this does not date to the Viking Age, it's still evidential of significant maritime warrior activity in and around Denmark. Now, later on, we move forward and we're treated to a few bits and pieces of early medieval boats. Now, the reason I've chosen these select examples is because I think they form a nice family tree or timeline that leads us into these more well-known Viking longship examples. And not all of these boat parts are from longships or boats that would become longships in the future. Rather, they just represent different aspects, different arms, if you like, of North Sea boat building traditions before the Viking Age. So the Bruges fragments, for example, date from the Roman period. So too do the Mainz fragments, operating out of a shipyard that saw activity well into the 5th century, and also an oarlock from Norway. So across this 300-year span, we've got tattered fragments of boats and oarlocks, demonstrating again, if not raiding activity, then certainly maritime commerce around the southern North Sea area. Now, this really was a seascape of activity, and this is exemplified nowhere better than the Needham boat, which rather should be called the Needham boats, because contrary to popular belief, this was not one vessel, but a few. There's the largest, which is somewhat analogous to the shape of the Sutton Hoo vessel, which I'll get onto in a moment. But there are also some smaller examples. And again, like the Hjortspring boat from earlier, this was found in what was once a bog with a vast assemblage of weapons. So while it's not from the Viking Age, again, we see a clinker-built vessel not too far away from the silhouette of a longship, with evidence of large-scale armies operating in and around the waterways of Scandinavia. Now, this to me would fit the description of a Viking, a sea rover, but we're not yet in the Viking Age. Let's move forward. We've got some scary figureheads from the Scheldt. The one in the middle is my favourite. I just wanted to mention that. I think it looks fantastic. And these aren't Viking. Again, these are what you'd probably call Merovingian, or at least these figureheads are. The Merovingian dynasty being, of course, the rulers of France and Germany before, roughly speaking, the 8th century. Moving forward, we've got, again, some boat fragments, what you might call rib fragments from Denmark. And a key thing I like here about these maritime archaeological remains is that it overlaps quite neatly with the thought process that underpin quite a lot of paleontological research. So for those of you who are exclusively interested in human history, paleontology is the study of animals and plants in prehistory, processes of the earth and so on. Now, because this isn't a lecture about that, I won't go into too much detail, but if any of you are familiar with the work of Dean Lomax and other paleontologists, then whenever marine reptiles from, for example, the Jurassic period are uncovered, occasionally it might just be a very small fragment of, let's say, a jawbone, but expert paleontologists can use even a small fragment to hypothesize with reasonable certainty the overall size of the beastie. And it's the same logic here with these boat fragments. Like the ones that I showcased earlier, we can use them as a best guess as to how big the wider vessels were. And again, we're nearing the size of the Sutton Hoo vessel with some of these examples. Oh, there we go. Just on cue, Sutton Hoo. That rhymes. But we don't actually know who was in Sutton Hoo. Many people think it was the East Anglian king Redvold, but a recent article by Helen Gittos, I believe it was 2024, suggested that princely burials like these, that date mainly from the late 6th, 7th century in England, they actually belong to elites on the fringe of royal authority, perhaps having served overseas in places as far afield as Syria or Georgia. So these aren't perhaps king's mounds or king's ships, but potentates from afar, mercenary warlords attempting to impose their aura, their influence over the landscape itself after death, or rather it was the communities that remembered them. So Sutton Hoo, I'm sure many people watching this have heard of Sutton Hoo. It's the poster child for what many call the Anglo-Saxon period, although the individual interred within probably didn't consider himself in that way. He probably didn't wake up every morning and say, I'm an Anglo-Saxon. He may have had a more insular, tribal or local identity, whilst also being a citizen of the wider North Sea seascape, this kind of nexus of activity that links boats and goods and people from, for this example, Suffolk rather, in East Anglia in England. Then we've got Denmark and again the Low Countries. So lots of different locations, but it's a similar boat building tradition across them all. Now the Sutton Hoo boat, it's large, but did it have a sail? Debates will rage on and on and on about that question. Now, our great book here is John Haywood's Dark Age Naval Power from about 30 years ago now. So it's reasonably old, but it's still probably the best work just about early medieval maritime power. And in the book, he hypothesizes, and I'd be inclined to agree, that we just can't overlook that sails probably existed on many of these boats. They're referenced in numerous historical texts from the time period, and we also have odd bits of graffiti, for example from Carlby, that depict boats with sails. Now, making a sail takes a lot of man-hours. It takes a lot of sheep, then it takes a lot of time to weave the sail itself. This implies significant resources and command over others, maybe not necessarily slaves, but certainly people, workers, or so on. Now, this suggests some kind of authority. So did boats before the Viking Age have sails in the North Sea? I'd say almost definitely yes, but maybe the question should be, was there many? Maybe not. And as we'll get closer to the Viking Age, we'll be able to answer that question in a slightly different way. In any case, we move away from sails to looking at the buildings, or rather burial mounds, that boats were occasionally housed in. Now, as with the earlier paleontological reference, there's a few barrow mounds, well, I mean, I'd say more than a few, across the coast of Norway, and there's a few in England, of course, that once housed very large timber ships. And some of these mounds, while the contents have rotted away, such as these examples near Avaldsnes in southwest Norway, the sheer size of them suggests that the boat within was really big. And we're talking possibly bigger than Sutton Hoo. Now, the reason I've kind of cherry-picked these two examples in particular is because they're within reasonable proximity, within a landscape of power, to a site called Avaldsnes, which, if you've heard of Avaldsnes, you'll know it next to the name Dagfinn Skray, who's another seminal archaeologist who's published and led the research project on this site. Now, this is some kind of quasi-pirate centre of lordship, not dissimilar to a site in England that I'll talk about in a short while. So, pirate sites, maybe pirate ships, and all before the Viking Age. And I can't move forward without mentioning the recent overview of one at Herlogshaugen, which is just north of Avaldsnes, further up the Norwegian coast. Now, that article is open access, well worth a read. After that, we move on to what many would call the Viking ship, or at least something that looks really close to it. This is the Kvalsund example. From, again, Norway. Was it sailed or was it rowed? I think the debate is still up in the air there. It's certainly big enough to have supported a mast with a sail, but the jury is still out. Now, if we really want to find a dawn of the Vikings, it lies not in the North Sea, but in the Baltic. This is the duology of longships Salme 1 and 2 from an island off the coast of Estonia. Now, the debate here is not did they have a sail, but what are these Swedish diplomats doing? And are they diplomats? Or are we looking at early, pre-Lindisfarne Viking raiders from Sweden? Isotopically, they've been traced to Sweden. So are they perhaps a military party, some envoys from the Yngling dynasty going to the islands off the coast of Estonia? Or are they just a group of pirates? Certainly the wealth on display would suggest the former, but one man's privateer is another man's pirate, as the Spanish discovered when they tallied with Sir Francis Drake in the 16th century. And again, no matter the time period, we come up against these hurdles. What distinguishes a pirate from a royal envoy with a privateering mission? What distinguishes a Viking from all of these people doing military exercises or some kind of raiding activity or commercial / raiding in longships across the centuries beforehand? That's the family tree. I'll leave that question hanging. But consider this. Each longship is not just a vessel. I like to think of them as forests trapped in time. Dozens of trees, some really large, that have had their entire length bent and bowed to form the keel, others sawed into planks. Each piece of wood is then soaked in tar, some cases animal fat, plant fibres. It takes ages. You've got to make tar pits, which requires a lot of heat, again, significant resources and manpower. And that's not even without mentioning the sail and also the all-weather clothing for the crew. So every longship on this family tree is a sizable undertaking, and it makes you think about the resources that rulers or warlords or pirate kings and queens, whatever we may call them, had at their disposal. Same question could be asked of Sutton Hoo, as with Salme 1 and 2, as with the Neiden boat, the Hjortsprung boat, and of course, into the Viking Age proper, the Oseberg ship. Now, some of these vessels may have just been for trade. Others may have had slightly more nefarious purposes. But why go Viking in the first place? Why follow a pirate's life? Well, you asked the question of Jack Sparrow, he'd probably reply with something witty in his usual kind of slurry accent. You ask the question of people today, why did the Vikings raid? And depending on who you ask and their level of interest in the subject, these two are usually the initial suggestions. Now, there's been a few academic papers published on this subject. I'm thinking of John Barrett's article, Steve Ashby's article, about what motivated mainly men to go out and raid, and why was it so popular? Because one raid started another, which started more and more and more. Sooner or later, you have the Viking Age. I mean, these processes, they really underpin the dawn of the Vikings. So we really need to understand what would convince someone to raid. And I think sometimes we can't see the wood for the trees. Simple answer, I believe, is just wealth. Not necessarily coined money, because a lot of the places raided did not have coined money. Certainly if we look to the east, around the southern Baltic area, there would have been Viking activity, as we perhaps can see near Estonia. But instead of showcasing itself in the archaeological record as burnished silverware or the caved-in skulls of monks, it's probably the capture of fur and amber, the corralling of traders around river routes. So it's a different form of violence, maybe more intimidation than lobbing an axe through someone's head. In any case, around the North Sea to the west, you did have maybe not an outbreak of raiding, but certainly one raid leading to another. So think about the young raiders returning from Lindisfarne or some Pictish monastery in the far north of Scotland that wasn't recorded. They come home to Norway, Denmark, wherever. They arrive back in the market centre, which is just, imagine like a city of tents that only shows up in summer. And they've got all this bling. Oh, what's Sven wearing? Why is Joe Viking coming in with 20 monks? It's not that England wouldn't have been known about in Scandinavia, far from it, but rather, was the wealth on display in monasteries a known quantity before someone decided to raid it and ship it overseas? And I think these questions, as the great archaeologist Terry Barnes suggests, can be asked of the Viking Age, just like they can of not only other historical eras, but also other characters, not only from real life, but also pop culture. So, for example, what compels Walter White to make loads of money? What compels Tony Soprano to sit atop his empire of dollars and never move? What compels post-apocalyptic warlord Negan from The Walking Dead to impose harsh tributes on lots of different communities under him with the sole purpose of extracting wealth and surplus? It's, well, wealth. And also how power can be exercised through wealth. Now, in the 2016 edited volume, Comparative Perspectives, a number of authors revisit this topic called maritoria, which, to quote them, is a form of power combining the aspirations of petty kings with ideas of territory and market domination. Some might say a form of proto-capitalism, or at least business. Now, how this manifests in the archaeological record is through sites like Avaldsnes, another one in England we'll talk about in a moment, and also representations of military prowess. And certainly around Scandinavia, this military prowess appears closely tied to water. So we see motifs like this pop up in another somewhat arbitrarily designated period, the Nordic Bronze Age, just as we see it in the Caribbean in the golden age of piracy around places like Nassau. And we see it, of course, in the Viking Age. But these are all three islands of history. And like I said at the start, if there was, for example, an immortal being who lived through all three, they wouldn't necessarily recognize these distinctions. It's not like the sky would change color. They'd know that they entered the Viking Age. But nevertheless, these social processes, to some extent, become more apparent in these three eras of history. And of course, other ones too. I'm just cherry picking there. So the way I see it is I do a lot of analogizing in my teaching, both for postgraduates and also primary school level. And it really depends on the audience, how well an analogy sits. But one that I've found pretty decent success with when talking about why people would go Viking is to analogize with a dead man's shoes job market. Now, if no one has heard that phrase before, it's essentially something like the heritage sector in the UK, where you'll have a lot of really ambitious people operating within a closed hierarchy. So there's no jobs, but you've got lots of people who want the job. And in seeking the equivalent of wealth and power, they go, right, if I can't get it within this sector, or in the Viking Age's case, within Scandinavia, where you had lots of petty kingdoms that were quite closed off, I'm going to go elsewhere to find my fame, find my fortune, which would be monasteries like Lindisfarne. Then when they return, these young upstarts inspire others to follow in their footsteps. Wow, Sven's got loads of silver from that raid over the North Sea. Why are we bothering here? Let's go. And then that starts to disrupt the hierarchical pattern, which might be entirely domestic or at least centered on a different area of power. This creates societal upheaval, domestic strife, which therefore opens up new opportunities for groups to mature and go Viking in even more ways. Now, you see this play out in the first 30 to 35 years of the Viking Age. It's why in 794, a year after the Lindisfarne raid, we have a reference to all the isles in Britain being raided. Now, on one hand, this might be a bit of exaggeration on behalf of the West Saxon chroniclers. On the other hand, it may be evidential of stage 3 of that 6-stage process. It's why in the year 810, we hear of a massive Viking army invading Frisia, which is somewhat coterminous with the modern Netherlands. Now, this is a big ramping up of scale across about 20 years, even less since Lindisfarne. So this, for me, is a conceptual framework rooted in analogies and kind of based on a modern phenomenon. But I think it has merit in trying to unpick the minds of what some might call proto-Vikings. Now, I mentioned how this appears in historical deposits or archaeological residues, if you like. Now, the earlier site I mentioned of Avoldsnes is what has been called, among many things, a sea king's residence or a pirate palace. And you see not identical, but certainly not too dissimilar evidence at an East Anglian site at the other end of the North Sea in England called Rendlesham. Now, Rendlesham has gold and garnet bullion en masse. It's got foreign coinage. Some of it's been clipped and kind of turned into hack silver and hack metal. You also have a few ingots of hack metal. Now, usually this material, you'd assume, dates from the 9th century, from the era of Viking army camps, as is much discussed by Dawn Hadley, Julian Richards, Dave Holdenby, Trix Randerson, and so on. But at Rendlesham, it's dated about 200 years earlier, before the Viking Age, and yet it's a similar social process that can be pieced together from these bits of ephemera. Now, Bede writes about Rendlesham. He calls it a royal villa, and East Anglian kings placed great emphasis on the site, especially in the 6th and 7th centuries. Then it started to peter off in favour of the market town at Ipswich. But for a brief period, Rendlesham might have been a kind of quasi-royal pirate palace, not perhaps home to Vikings, but certainly an Old English equivalent. Food for thought. Now we move on to the third section of who were the first Vikings. And this is less about the social processes that inspired them to raid and more about what others thought. And for this, we have to go way back to the almost tail end of the ancient Greek era, moving into the Roman period. Of course, somewhat wishy-washy definitions between the two. This is the root term Germanic. Now, I believe off the top of my head, this comes from either Polybius or Posidonius. In any case, it's 2nd century BC, a term roughly equating to Germanic or Germanoi, and it means in the north, people from the north. This term is later popularized by Julius Caesar, and then it's applied to groups that aren't quite the Scythicae or the Celticae. It's Germanic. Nowadays, we use this term to mean languages. So, for example, English is a Germanic language. But depending on what you read, you may see it applied to anything from burial mounds to art to helmets to coins, all sorts. But not everything can be Germanic. Beowulf is Germanic on one hand, Sutton Hoo is Germanic. You know, the moniker almost stands for too much. And its roots lie in Roman military ethnography, along with lots of other terms. So I'm going to run through a bunch of groups that were classified broadly as Germanic, meaning they were from either Germania, which is coterminous with France, Germany, mainly Germany, parts of Frisia, the Netherlands, moving into Denmark and beyond. So northern raiders operating across the Roman period, beyond and then into the Viking Age. Now, we hear of these pirates, but are they Vikings? No, because they predate the Lindisfarne raid. But if we piece all of this evidence together, we get a different family tree. It's not one of longships. It's one of the people aboard the longships and all of their varied names. So we start with the Brook Terry, defeated somewhere along the River Ems. That's it. That's all we get. Now there's way more. Oh dear, maybe too much. We've got references to Saxons conquering the North Frisian Islands, tail end of the 1st century. We've got Franks, which is a term that's popularized from the 2nd century onwards, gets increasingly popular into the 3rd century. Maybe it's a term that describes the same people as the Saxons, but it just overtook the former in popular usage, in the vocabulary currency of the time. Some of these more obscure terms, like Heruli, for example, might be describing subgroups within these greater tribal confederacies or groups from particularly noteworthy geographic origins. So the Heruli, for example, are occasionally thought to specifically hail from Arctic Norway, but there's another group from the Danube that may have the same name. In any case, this paints a consistent picture of bouts of piratical activity in the North Sea. Then we have a kind of 300-year gap from the end of Roman Britain up to the Lindisfarne raid, where if you were to rely on ethnographic data like this, it'd look like piracy stops altogether. But by the 4th century, after an event mentioned by Ammianus Marcellinus, the Barbarico Conspiratio, you'll have to forgive my Latin there, I'm an early medievalist, not a Romanist, textual references start to become retrospective, meaning they're no longer describing contemporary events or even near contemporary. They're looking back and either making them up or exaggerating them. Now, we've got a few examples, for example. From a collection of saints' lives, we hear of Saxon raids on Orkney, which I believe is from the Historia Britonum, actually, not a saint's life, which is a 9th century Welsh source. We've got Saxons allegedly invading Britain in the mid-5th century, and I'm sure you've heard their names, Hengist and Horsa, big names, and also all of their children and kin. Now, these figures, they come from the same legendary soup as King Arthur, albeit with a slightly different language. But when placed in this greater timeline, they might instead, if real, have been pirate warlords, taking advantage of withdrawal of Roman legions and the slow decline of established economic networks within the North Sea. That's just one theory, of course. Now, we do have a few contemporary references to pirates before the Viking Age and after the Roman period. So from the often called Dark Ages, in this case meaning the 5th and 6th centuries, we have, for example, the writings of moneyed individuals like Sidonius Apollinaris, who writes on the Saxons, "Every oarsman is an arch pirate. Captains and crews alike, to a man they teach or learn the art of brigandage." So the Saxon, he says, is the most ferocious of all foes. He comes on you without warning. When you expect his attack, he makes away. Now, that's what's made the Vikings so effective about 300 years after this. They're referenced in sources like the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle as evading payback after raids, which made them highly effective at targeting riverine sites and sailing away or rowing away before land-based armies could deal a counterattack. If they pursue, the Saxon overtakes. If the Saxon flies himself, he is never caught. Now, Sidonius here is talking about people he calls the Saxons. He's not talking about the people we call the Vikings. They're from, allegedly, 2 different geographic origins. But one man's Saxon might have been another man's Frank. The ethnographic divisions between these different groups are very, very blurry. They're hard to pinpoint today, especially in an era where, for example, languages like Old Frisian and Old English were very similar. Now, on the Frisians, we have an equally spurious mention of potential piratical activity from roughly the same period. So this comes from a compilation of geographical data, if you like, from the early medieval period. And in a description about the Frisians, they're referenced as being especially strong in piracy, just like the Saxons. And the Frisians are from the modern Netherlands. Now, again, that's another landscape, or maybe one might say seascape, that, like Scandinavia, like the fjords, like the swamps, is, well, I mean, it's not hard to see why water would play such an important role, nor why people in boats would occupy such an important status within social hierarchies. The Frisians, the most fearsome maritime race, writes the somewhat anonymous compiler of the Fredegar Chronicle. Then we've got the Franks as well. So, in a separate letter, Sidonius talks about a Frankish warlord that showed up and he witnessed them. And apparently, just like the Saxons were associated with boats and the Frisians were associated with being strong in piracy, the Franks were associated with gleaming scarlet and gold and pure white silk. Not necessarily maritime prowess, but that same archaeological signature of garnet and gold can be detected all across England. More recent discovery is the one pictured on screen. This is the Pocella panel from Pocklington in East Yorkshire, which in the early medieval period would have been a tidal flatland, very, very close to the sea. So are we looking at the costume of a Frank, or just a pirate with no fixed geographic origin, or maybe just some loot? Here lies the difficulty in trying to pinpoint on maps Saxon pirates, Frisian pirates, Frankish pirates, Scandinavian pirates. Rather, all of these terms may represent the political maturation of disparate pirate armies between the crises of the 3rd and 5th centuries in the late Roman period. Now, amidst this time, you had a succession of emperors and warlords who thought they were emperors, assassinating or beating one another in battle. This turmoil, along with affecting the quality of coins and the spread of the grain tax and the availability of resources for militaries, it also fragmented where legions and so on were stationed. So you had this kind of creation of new centers of gravity across the Roman Empire, which many would call warlordism, where you had these new people-centered military hierarchies. Magnus Maximus is a famous example from Britannia. But this process would have continued past another somewhat arbitrary date of 410, which is typically seen as the end of Roman Britain, and 476, the death of Romulus Augustulus and the end of the Western Empire. Now, again, these weren't fixed points in time, a la Doctor Who, where people at the time would realize, oh God, the Roman period's over, all the lights go off. Hello to the Dark Ages. Far from it. So these groups, varied terms and so on, we might be looking at what I call kind of new Romes, or what David Castriota might call Romans after Rome, the creation of new gravity centers, centered on central people rather than institutions. And these pirate groups, they may have origins that lie in this murky window. Now, we've established some ground rules there. We've looked at the technology, and again, it's a very long timeline up to the Viking Age. We've looked at the motivations for people to raid, which aren't even period specific, really. And then we've looked at some of the terms given to pirates before the Viking Age. And they have varied geographic origin. Now, let's look once again at some different names. So, there's various brilliant Old Norse pieces of literature, and some of my favourite aren't the mentions of Ragnarok or even the Icelandic sagas, but kind of odd lists of essentially Viking Age puns. And many reference really archaic Old Norse names that are probably already old and out of fashion by the time they'd been written down in the 12th and 13th centuries, some even older than that. And many of these names, I'm thinking of a metrical list of sea kings' names in particular, they're things like just vague descriptors of different roles a person could play on a boat. And because some of these names are so old and so obsolete, they likely date from quite far back in history, into Scandinavian prehistory, maybe 9th, 8th, 7th century. And again, because the emphasis is on boats and seamanship, it suggests an entirely different origin to a sudden emergence of sea wolves on the horizon off the coast of Northumberland. Here is a slower, more discreet process centered on people, or at least nicknames, that become transcribed through legend to become characters. Now, if there were raids before Lindisfarne, we're going to circle back now to the inquiry question at hand. Who were the first Vikings? If there were raids before Lindisfarne, they are scattered to the mists of deep time. Some have been entirely obscured by legend, others never made it into chronicles, or if they did, the chronicles were then burned or lost, or got too soggy, which happens often in England. We also have archaeological material that may be interpreted in a way that suggests a raid, or at least a Scandinavian presence. So I've got 5 examples. The first is a charter from Mercia. It's dated to the arse end of the 8th century, just before the Lindisfarne raid, and the context is it's a declaration from Offa, king of the Mercians, about a few reforms, mainly money related, that he wanted to exercise over Kent, which was a troublesome part of his territory. Now, of note is the text in bold. He says, pagans at sea. Who are these pagans? Well, that's it. That's it. That's all the information we get. Sea rovers, raiders in boats, pagans at sea, who are a threat to churches in Kent. And they were among a number of problems that affected the end of Offa's realm. A recent book by Rory Naismith unpicks the entirety of Offa's realm, and so does a recent book by Max Adams. And this is just one of a number of problems. But this might push the Viking Age back by a year at least. 792, we've got the presence of pagans at sea near Kent, near Sussex. Now, we don't know where they're from. It's quite probable, based on what happens the year after, that they're Scandinavian or at least Frisian in origin. In any case, pagans at sea. Now, we move much further north than Kent for our second example, and we move quite far away from text full stop. This is a site at least the last time I checked, remains mostly unexcavated in the northernmost Isle of Shetland. And what we're looking at here is a few longhouses, many of which, like I said, have not been excavated and have not been subject to rigorous dating. Yet their overall structure, from the few examples that have been excavated, is, for lack of a better word, primitive compared to later Viking Age longhouses. So the suggestion is that these are quite early. They match up with the floor plans of 8th and very early 9th century longhouses from Scandinavia. So it might be indicative of an early wave of Scandinavian settlers, because we know they did dominate Shetland very early in the Viking Age. And some of these migratory processes may have been occurring before the Lindisfarne raid. So this is less violence, more of the settlement side of the Viking Age, but still, the jury's out on this one. Number 3, here's what people may be more familiar with. Now, this is actually referenced quite often. This is a direct mention in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle of a Viking raid, or at least, according to a later West Saxon edit, the first ships of the Danish man that sought the land of the English nation. Now, there's obviously a bit of bias in there. King Alfred's court whipped up some edits, most people think anyway. In any case, predates Lindisfarne. On the south coast of England, you may have had, if you stumbled onto the beach between the years 787 or 789, the presence of some besmirched merchants from Denmark. Now, was this a raid, or was this a bit of a kerfuffle with the local shire reeve or sheriff? Again, we don't know, but at least by the end of the 9th century, this event was considered the start, for lack of a better word, of the period of Danish raiding. Around that same time, we actually have a reference to shameful pagans in a capitulary from Alcuin of York, who I mentioned right at the start. So we're bringing this kind of full circle, I suppose, by returning back to him. And I'm actually based in York now, so maybe Alcuin's ghost is lingering over my shoulder, or maybe he's over the sea in Aachen, I'm not sure. In any case, he wasn't happy about these people. He's referring to pagans, but again, we don't know if he's talking about North Sea heathens who he may have heard about in continental markets, or he may have visited Northumbria, or he might be describing kind of Anglo-Pictish secular elites up in southern Scotland who he didn't like. Either one could really match. In any case, the language used is not far off later descriptors given to the Vikings. Finally, a silly one, if you may, or potentially not silly at all, we have a kind of quite crazy, a high to late medieval reference from a piece of work by Thomas of Elmham that references, and I almost didn't believe it when I read it, the first Danish raid in 753, 40 years before Lindisfarne. Apparently Danes raided Kent, or a monastery near Kent. That's it. If this is true, clearly didn't make a big dent on the consciousness at the time, for it wasn't recorded anywhere but this source. If it's not true, it probably reflects particular source interest in that monastery in question. Now, if we had all the time in the world, we could unpick all 5 of these. But the point for showing you is that when put together with some of the late and post-Roman piracy, we've got a nice, if blurry, timeline of piratical episodes. And they make the Lindisfarne raid look like just another one, which I think is how the event should be approached. Of course, it was significant. It's not to say it wasn't significant, but that it wasn't isolated. And it also doesn't mark the horizon of something new. It marks change, yes, but not change from no raids to many, but perhaps some raids and then more raids, or at least the growth, maturation of a raiding culture. Food for thought. We ask questions, we don't always know the answers. Curiosity. If you are afraid, we will go back down. Read joyfully. And that's really the advice I give every student. Read joyfully. There's a big kind of square out the corner of my webcam at the moment, which is a new bookshelf I put up to house more books. Read joyfully on any subject, ancient world, ancient studies, Viking Age. Here are some suggestions for books, many of which I believe I referenced in that talk. Here are some of my own books, 2 of which are not currently released, and I welcome any questions, if there are any. If not, remember what Alcuin said, curiosity. Thank you very much for listening.
Amazing. Thank you, Alex. There's a lot of stuff in there. I am floored. I'm gonna have to go grab one of your books so I can read some more
Hey,
into it.
thank you.
We only got a heart in the chat from one of our subscribers, so they were very interested in your chat.
Cool.
Thank you so much for this masterclass. This was fantastic. I am going to throw this up, and that way we can just go over a couple other things because this is our birthday bash. And if you're just joining us and you actually don't know what SASA is, we'd love to share more about it. So Save Ancient Studies Alliance, and this is where we work to promote the study of the ancient world and engagement with our human deeper past, just as Alex was just talking about with us. We build a grassroots movement through outreach, collaboration, accessibility, and public scholarship that we work toward our goal of inspiring a world inclusive of community of scholars, learners, and students. You can find SASA anywhere on any platform by just searching Save Ancient Studies. Alex has some books. Can they find you on any social media for you, Alex?
Yeah, I'm Blue Sky. I'm a Blue Sky man. Just my
Perfect. All
name
right.
on Blue Sky, Alex Harvey.
Beautiful. We'll go find Alex on socials as well, and that way you can keep up with all of his research. Couple other things, guys. We are in the middle of our birthday bash fundraiser. Our masterclass is just one of the many events that we put on over the course of the year. If you know somebody within the SASA organization, we are currently, as of today, starting our triathlon. Every volunteer and intern who gets a donation from an outside source that puts their name on it will be in a competition running internally. So every little bit helps, but definitely help out any source that you have within our community. Our funding goes to service any of our master classes, Archeo live gaming streaming sources, resources that we have accessible to you guys. If you enjoy our events, please consider becoming a reoccurring donor. It's $3 a month, and you can help us save ancient studies. We also can encourage you guys to go to our bookstore. We have a book club that runs. 10% of those proceeds from our bookstore do come back to SASA. And you can also find our merchandise on our bazaar, which is really fun gear that we have for the entire community. But thank you everyone for joining us for this masterclass today. We love seeing all of your engagement. We've had quite a few viewers for this class. We're very excited. Events coming up over our birthday bash week continue tomorrow. We have a masterclass names in the landscape of Scotland and the Northern Isles. On Friday, we have another masterclass titled Sky Weavers and Shark Women, the Royal Women and Places in Ancient Mayan Inscriptions. We have a break over the weekend, but don't panic. We are going to be back on Monday for a panel discussion on Odyssey adaptations. And then that is going to be followed by a live Archeo gaming session. You can view more information about all of these events on our website. You can also RSVP on our website as well. We hope to see all of you at future events for us. But thank you again, Alex, for joining us, and we will see you all next time.
Thank you very much.
Bye, guys.